Harold Miller had been coming to Rosie's Diner for 23 years now. Every Tuesday and Friday morning at 8:30 sharp, he would settle into the same red vinyl booth by the window where he could watch the morning traffic and remember better days. The coffee was always hot and black, just the way Margaret used to make it before she passed 5 years ago. And the waitresses knew to bring him 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast without him having to ask. Harold wore his Navy veteran cap with quiet pride, though the years had bent his shoulders and silver whiskers now covered cheeks that once knew the sting of ocean spray during his service in the Pacific. On this particular Tuesday morning, Harold noticed the diner seemed different. Somehow, there was a tension in the air that made the usual chatter feel forced and the clatter of silverware sound sharper than usual. At the counter sat a younger man with angry eyes and restless hands that drummed impatiently on the formica surface. Harold recognized the type from his years working construction after the Navy. Some folks carried their troubles on the outside where everyone could see them, like storm clouds that never quite broke into rain. The young man kept glancing around the diner, with the kind of look that said he was looking for trouble, or maybe trouble was looking for him. Harold tried to focus on his newspaper, but something about the stranger's energy made him uneasy in a way he hadn't felt since those long nights on watch duty decades ago. Sarah, the youngest waitress, approached the counter with the kind of careful smile she reserved for difficult customers. She was maybe 25 with kind eyes, and the patient manner of someone who had learned that gentleness often worked better than firmness. The angry young man began complaining loudly about everything from the temperature of his coffee to the speed of service, using words that made Harold wince and caused other diners to look down at their plates. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but Harold could see the slight tremor in her hands as she refilled the man's cup. The situation escalated quickly, as these things sometimes do. The young man's voice grew louder and his language more colorful, until even the kitchen staff stopped their work to listen. Harold found himself gripping his coffee cup tighter, remembering other times when he had witnessed bullies in action, and wondering if his old bones still had the strength to stand up for what was right. That's when the unthinkable happened. The angry young man suddenly stood up and without warning struck Harold across the face with the back of his hand. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot, and for a moment everything went completely silent. Harold's Navy cap fell to the floor and blood began to trickle from his lip. The pain was sharp, but what hurt more was the shock of such unprovoked cruelty from someone young enough to be his grandson. The other diners sat frozen, in their seats unsure of what to do or say. Sarah dropped her coffee pot, which shattered on the linoleum floor, adding to the surreal nature of the moment. Harold touched his lip with shaking fingers and looked up at his attacker with more confusion than anger. He had survived the war and 40 years of hard labor and the slow grief of watching his beloved Margaret slip away. But this random act of violence against an old man seemed somehow worse than all of that. The young man seemed pleased with himself, as if striking an elderly veteran had somehow solved whatever problems were eating at him from the inside. He stood over Harold with a sneer that suggested he might not be finished with his cruel display. But then the front door of the diner opened with the soft chime of the bell that usually announced arriving customers looking for nothing more than a hot meal and friendly service. This time, however, what walked through that door changed everything. A man in his 40s entered, first wearing a denim vest covered with patches that told stories of long rides down empty highways. Behind him came 3 more men dressed similarly, their presence filling the small diner with a different kind of energy entirely. These were not angry young men looking for fights they could not finish. These were seasoned riders who had learned that true strength came from protecting those who could not protect themselves. The first man through the door had steel gray eyes and the kind of face that had seen both kindness and cruelty and had chosen kindness. He took in the scene immediately. Harold sitting in his booth with blood on his lip, his Navy cap on the floor. The young man standing over him with fists still clenched. Sarah backed against the counter with tears in her eyes, the shattered coffee pot on the floor, the other diners watching with the helpless expression of people who wanted to help but didn't know how. The rider walked slowly toward Harold's booth, his boots making soft sounds on the linoleum. When he reached the table, he knelt down and gently picked up the Navy cap, brushing off invisible dust before placing it carefully back on Harold's head pop. he said in a voice that carried both tenderness and authority. "Are you all right?" Harold looked up into eyes that seemed familiar, though he was certain they had never met. The kindness he saw there reminded him of his own son Robert, who had been killed in a car accident 15 years earlier. "I'm fine, son," Harold said, though his voice shook slightly. "Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure." The rider stood and turned to face the young man, who suddenly seemed much smaller than he had moments before. Now his voice carried a different tone entirely. What exactly happened here? The young man's bravado began to crumble under the steady gaze of someone who clearly would not be intimidated. He started to mumble excuses about slow service and disrespect, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The rider listened without interruption. His hands relaxed at his sides, but his presence filling the space between protection and consequence. Behind him, his companions had positioned themselves near the exits, not to trap anyone, but to ensure that whatever happened next would happen according to rules of decency that seemed to have been forgotten. When the young man finished his stammering explanation, the rider nodded slowly, as if considering the weight of what he had heard. He looked back at Harold, who was dabbing at his lip with a paper napkin. Then he returned his attention to the young man. "You hit an 81-year-old Navy veteran. It wasn't a question." The young man's face had gone pale, and he seemed to realize for the first time the magnitude of what he had done. "I didn't mean," he started to say, but the rider held up a hand for silence. Harold watched this exchange with growing amazement. He had spent years feeling invisible in a world that seemed to have forgotten the value of older folks. Yet here was this stranger treating him with the kind of respect he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. The rider turned back to Harold, and in a gesture that brought tears to the old man's eyes, knelt down again. "Sir, my name is Michael. This is my father-in-law." Tom Harold's breath caught in his throat. "You're Robert's boy," he whispered. Michael nodded. "Dad told me stories about you before he passed, about how you taught him to fish at Miller's Creek, and how you always had time to throw a baseball even after working. Double shifts." Harold's eyes filled with tears as memories rushed back. Little Mickey, who used to sit on his knee and listen to stories about the Navy, who had grown up to marry his beloved son's girlfriend after the accident, because Robert had made him promise to take care of her. "I haven't seen you since the funeral," Harold said. "You were just a kid." "Then I'm not a kid anymore," Michael replied with a gentle smile. "And I brought some friends who believe the same thing I do. That family looks out for family, and that includes taking care of those who served our country." He stood and faced the young man again. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Harold. Not because you're afraid of us, but because it's the right thing to do. You're going to pay for everyone's breakfast in this diner. And you're going to take some time to think about how you treat people who deserve better." The young man looked around the diner at faces that no longer showed fear, but rather disappointment in his behavior. Something in their expressions seemed to reach him in a way that anger never could. Harold watched as the young man's defensive posture slowly crumbled. "I'm sorry," he said finally, looking directly at Harold. "I'm really sorry, sir. I know what got into me. You didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that." Harold studied the young man's face and saw something there that reminded him of his younger self. The confusion and frustration that sometimes comes with being lost in a world that seems to offer few second chances. "Son," Harold said softly, "we all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them." The young man nodded, and Harold could see that the lesson was beginning to take hold. Michael helped Harold to his feet and guided him toward a larger table where they could all sit together. As they settled in, Harold found himself surrounded by men who wore their loyalty like armor, but offered their friendship like a gift. Tom, Michael's father-in-law, turned out to be a veteran, himself from a different war but carrying the same understanding of service and sacrifice. The other riders, Jake and Danny, were family men who spent their weekends volunteering at VA hospitals and organizing charity rides for Gold Star families. Breakfast was served. Harold found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, about his time in the Pacific and the friends he had lost and found, about Margaret and their 52 years of marriage, about Robert and the grandson he never got to meet because the accident happened just weeks before the baby was born. Michael listened to every word and shared stories of his own, about how Robert had talked about his father Consta,